Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's Top 10 Most Reckless Uses of Time Travel in Star Trek. This video is a Patreon requested video, requested by not one, but two Patreon supporters, Brendan Howes and Norman Buckwald. Thank you both for requesting this. Of course, they requested this. They happened to both request at the same time because I mentioned it in one of the videos I recorded recently. I believe it was my top 10 worst episodes of Modern Trek, that maybe one of these days I would do a top 10 most reckless uses of time travel in Star Trek. So one of these days is going to be now. But yes, I would, of course, thank you for the Patreon supporters for supporting my channel. Now, what this video is going to be about, I'm going to be ranking uses of time travel that is, they're kind of don't respect the timeline or not that careful with it. They're kind of reckless with their time travel and could cause, an alternate timeline or change the timeline, because Star Trek is very firmly established Type 2 time travel as their form of time travel. Of course, there's a few rules that, a few episodes or movies that break this rule, but typically Type 2 time travel would be if you travel back in time and you change something, that changes the one timeline. So the timeline you came from doesn't exist anymore because you changed it, and now you have to go back and fix it. And that being the case, you should be kind of careful with what you do with your time travel, and this top 10 is for examples where maybe they weren't as careful as they should have been. They were kind of reckless. Now, I want to make it clear that I'm excluding for the most part, yes, I will be excluding villains who purposely try to change the timeline for their advantage, because from a point of view you could say they're being reckless, but that's kind of the whole point, is that they want to change the timeline to suit their purposes. An example would be the Kremen from Year of Hell, or Arn Darvin from Trials and Tribulations, where yes, they're being a bit reckless, but the whole point is that they want to change the timeline for their advantage. So in those cases, or like the Borg in First Contact, traveling back and turning everyone into Borgs, or stopping First Contact, like that's what they want to do. So I'm not including examples like that. I'm including examples where mainly our heroes, sometimes not, but mainly where they go back in time and they're kind of not careful and not reckless and just reckless, and just messing up the timeline and not respecting it. Anyway, so before I get into my top 10 examples of most reckless uses of time travel, I'll start with 3 honorable mentions. First honorable mention is Firstborn, the Next Generation episode where a future version of Alexander, adult version of Alexander, travels back in time to make Alexander a tougher warrior to prevent wars of death. And then eventually, when that doesn't work, he decides to kill the younger version of himself. Of course, is stopped by Worf, but still maybe kind of reckless. Next honorable mention is Yesteryear, the animated series episode where Kirk and Spock are just very casually using the Guardian Forever to go back in time just to study history. And they come back and find the timeline had been completely altered because they've been doing this. So that's kind of it's kind of reckless. Although there are similar entries on my list that are worse, though. Anyway, last honorable mention is Timeless, the Voyager episode where Chakotay and Harry Kim from the future travel back in time to save Voyager. And in fact, LaForge and Starfleet, or Captain LaForge and Starfleet, try to stop them from doing so because because it is rather reckless of them to change it. They completely altered history so that the future they came from no longer exists. Of course, they did so to save our heroes, the main characters of the show, so we're okay with it. Anyway, now let me get into my top 10 most reckless uses of time travel, and we'll start with my number 10, A Matter of Time from Star Trek Next Generation. So, this episode is a unique example because the person who I think was most reckless about time travel was actually not seen in this episode, just mentioned, and the event where they were being reckless, again, was not seen in this episode. It happened off screen. But we do see the consequences of this person's recklessness, and I'm referring to the scientist from the future. I believe it was, I can't remember what century, 28th or 26th, something like that. Anyway, he traveled back in time to the 22nd century and was quite reckless and not careful because he got... I'm not sure if he was killed or not. I'm not sure whatever happened to him, but I do know is that some con man from the 22nd century stole his time ship and went back to the 24th century and posed as him in order to steal technology to try to pass it off as his own inventions in the 22nd century. And the event had it not been for the cleverness of the Enterprise crew, like Data, that he would have gotten away with it, and he would have severely altered the timeline. He would completely change the timeline because this dumb scientist was not careful enough when dealing with a con man and got conned and got his time ship stolen by some two-rate con man from New Jersey, as he says. So yeah, that was quite reckless. So number 9 on my list of most reckless uses of time travel is Carpenter Street. The Enterprise episode. Now, Daniels has always been kind of questionable with his time travel, but I could have chose Shockwave because he yanked Archer away from the timeline and doing so caused the whole history to change and his future was all messed up. But I think the time travel logic in that one's a bit askew. I don't really buy how it works because he yanked Archer to the future, and other examples like in Azadi Prime, and the future was fine. So I think that time travel is kind of not thought out very well. So I'm not doing that one. I'm choosing Carpenter Street instead, because he very well could have fucked up the whole timeline. Because yes, the Xindi were in early 21st century Detroit, where they didn't belong, trying to gather information, and hired this 2-bit drug addict to abduct people, which fucks with the timeline, and they were doing this to build a bioweapon to just kill out the entire human race. So yes, the Xindi needed to be stopped. But why the hell did Daniels decide to yank Archer and T'Pol, two people from I believe it's the 22nd century, who don't really have the knowledge of time travel. In fact, T'Pol didn't even believe in time travel until she traveled back in time, and yanked them. These important figures in history, by the way, especially Archer. They made it very clear that Archer was very important to history in founding the Federation. Yet Daniels yanked him outside the timeline and put him in a different time period where, as far as he knew, Archer could be killed, could die, because he's changing the timeline by yanking Archer and putting him back in this very deadly situation with Xindi. Why didn't Daniels just go his fucking self? What is he, too lazy? I think he gave some BS excuse in this episode, but I'm not buying this. With him going himself, it was like it's against the rules or something. Yeah, and yanking important historical figures from their timeline and putting them in dangerous situations not against the rules? Come on. Get out of here. That's reckless. Anyway, number 8 on my list is Future's End. Now, surprisingly, And this is from Voyager, and surprisingly, I'm not going to pick on Janeway. Not yet, anyway. Don't believe me, I will. But for this episode, it's actually more of Captain Braxton's fault. So the plot of this episode is Voyager's just going around the Delta Quadrant minding its own business when this ship from the future, I believe the 29th century, appears and tells Voyager that they're about to cause this huge disruption in the timeline and says, well, I gotta destroy your ship now. And of course Voyager fights back, and Captain Braxton's like, don't fight back. Of course they're going to. And in doing so, both ships get dragged into the 20th century, where this CEO tech guy steals all of his technology and uses it to cause the very disaster that Captain Braxton was trying to avoid. Great job! Great job, Captain Braxton. By the way, did he not consider that destroying Voyager, which had a lot of other, place in history, because Voyager did actually keep going as a ship and have a lot of significant effect on the 24th century, did he not think destroying them prematurely would perhaps damage the timeline? And he tries to blame Janeway for this later in the episode. Oh, it's your fault because you fought back. You were trying to destroy the ship. Of course they were gonna fight back. This guy is he's an idiot and he's reckless. Anyway, next we'll get into number 7 on my list. Star Trek 2009, a movie I really, really do not like. Now, this time I am going to choose the villain. I mean, Braxton wasn't really the villain of Futures End, but this time I'm choosing the villain, which I said I didn't really do in my intro, because I wouldn't say the Xindi, I wouldn't say them, for example, for going back in time and trying to create a bioweapon, because that's their whole purpose. They want to kill all humans. But with Nero, it's not so much that he's using time travel for nefarious purposes, because as I said, that is not a qualifier for this list. It's the fact that he has this knowledge that his whole race is going to die. And instead of using that knowledge to save his entire race, he instead goes off and blows up all these Federation planets and tries to get revenge on the Federation. Hey, dumbass, why don't you just send all these messages to Romulus warning them of the disaster, rather than let's just destroy the Federation, that way that will save my people. Why not actually just save your people? Why not try to get back to a different time period, or send all these messages to Romulus and say, hey, there's a fucking supernova coming that's gonna wipe us out, maybe we should prepare for that. But no, instead he has to go blow up planets for no good reason, because he's crazy. Yeah, it's terrible writing. But anyway, next on my list, number 6, sticking with the theme of movies, Star Trek The Voyage Home. Star Trek 4 The Voyage Home, you could even say. So, yes, Kirk and crew did need to go back in time to save the whales in order to stop this probe from destroying the future. Yes, they did bring whales into the future, and thus an extinct race is no longer extinct, but, that's fine, because they're not really affecting the past, they're affecting the present, or the future, or their present. So that's fine, that's all well and good. But when they were there, they were kind of reckless, because Scotty and McCoy go to this guy to make transparent aluminum, and Scotty gives him the formula for it that is future technology way beyond his capabilities, and he's complete in awe of seeing it. And McCoy sets him aside and says, by doing this you're changing our future. And he says, why? How do you know he didn't invent a bloody thing? Well, how I know, Scotty, and how McCoy knows, is that Star Trek is type 2 time travel, not type 1. I know sometimes Star Trek tries to cheat and be type 1, like in Captain's Holiday, or the Times Arrow episode, but really it's always been established as Type 2. Type 1 is the whatever happened, and so the logic Scotty was thinking, oh, maybe I was always meant to give him this formula, but no, Scotty, goddammit, that is not how time travel logic works in the Star Trek universe. It clearly works where if you go back in time and you do something that wasn't meant to be done, then whatever you do didn't happen before, but you're changing the timeline and you can alter the future. So by doing this, he was being very reckless and could have severely erased the timeline. I was surprised when they didn't go back to the 23rd century that it was completely different because of Scotty's meddling. But that's not the only example for this movie. There's also Kirk bringing the whale expert Gillian Taylor from 1984 to the 23rd century. I mean, how fucking reckless is that? How does he know that she didn't have children after the time she yanked them away, and that could have, there's a whole timeline could have been wiped out, or maybe she did something very important that set things in motion that created the 23rd century. And again, they could have arrived back to the 23rd century, and it can be completely altered from their very reckless behavior. But anywho, again, I'm going to stick with the theme of movies to get to my number 5 most reckless use of time travel in Star Trek, and that is Star Trek First Contact. So, I'm not talking about the Borg. I'm talking about Riker and Geordi and Troy, who just blurt out to Zefram Cochrane his fucking future. Now, granted, the excuse is that they need him to repair the Phoenix, but really, is giving him all this future knowledge important? I mean, Geordi even tells him about the statue. A statue that's meant to be built in his honor. And then Riker fucking quotes something that he'll say in the future. So now, will he really say that because he believes it, or just because Riker said he'd say that? They're really fucking with the timeline here. I am amazed that they didn't completely fuck everything up. But anywho, we'll get to my number 4, Assignment Earth from the original series. So now we're getting to the nitty-gritty of really reckless shit. So Kirk and crew are in the 20th century doing historical research. They're just hanging out there for no good reason. Why the fuck are you there? They could easily distort the timeline and fuck things up. Why are you just hanging out there for no good reason? Now, again, this is kind of similar to the yesteryear thing because that was also historical research, but this one's worse because Kirk intercepts a human being who was raised on another planet trying to travel to Earth. Now, he makes it very clear that he belongs in this century. He is from the 20th century, and by Kirk interfering with him, he is messing with the timeline. And does Kirk give a shit? No. Kirk continues to interfere with him continuously when he's trying to save the human race, and almost prevents him from doing so because he's like, oh, I don't know if I can trust him. Hey, Kirk, you're not supposed to be in that fucking century in the first place. Why are you messing with him? Jesus Christ. Anyway, that was a terrible episode anyway. Next, we'll get into my number 3 most reckless use of time travel, and that is Wrong's Darker Than Death or Night. So, in this episode, it's Deep Space Nine episode. So in this episode, Gul Dukat contacts Major Kira and says, hey, guess what? I've had an affair with your mother. I used to bang your mom. And Kira is quite disturbed by this, which, of course she should be. But what she decides to do is go to Captain Sisko and request the use of the Orb of Time. Now, the Orb of Time, as we know from its previous appearance in Trials and Tribulation, actually allows you to time travel. Now, I heard the excuse or the reasoning that this episode is actually not time travel, it's just a vision she's having, but that would actually be very inconsistent with how the Orb of Time has been established to operate. So we must logically deduce that this is in fact time travel, because that's what the Orb of Time has been shown to do. So she travels back in time to find out if her mother was having an affair with Gul Dukat. Now, first of all, what a reckless use. I can't believe Cisco actually gave her permission to do this. What a incredible reckless use to travel back where you could very easily interfere to the fine line just to find out if Gul Dukat banged your mom. I mean, I don't think that's a good enough reason, personally. So she does that, and once she's there, she does in fact find out that Gul Dukat was banging her mom, which, by the way, I'm going to mention in another video I'm doing about retcons, about terrible, worst retcons, but that video is going to come. You don't have to request that. We'll do it eventually. but anyway, I'm not talking about that now. I'm talking about time travel. So she finds out that Gul Dukat is banging her mom, and then proceeds to try to work with the resistance to kill her own mother. Now, granted, this was after she was born, so she wouldn't prevent her own birth, but still, she wants to kill her own mother. She wants to travel back in time and kill her own mother. Like, how fucking more reckless can you get than that? Like, now, granted, she changes her mind because she see how much her mother actually misses baby her and whatnot, but still, the whole thing was just such a reckless use of time travel. Everyone involved should get court-martialed for this event. Kira, Cisco, all of them should be thrown in the brig for almost like changing the entire past just to find out that some guy was banging your mom. Anyway, we'll get into number 2, second most reckless use of time travel, and that is the episode, or the season, I should say, that inspired this whole video. And that is Hide and Seek from Picard Season 2. Now, I'm actually choosing this episode as a stand-in for the entirety of Season 2 of Picard, because basically it tells one season. And there's this reckless use of time travel throughout the entire Season 2 of Picard, where they travel back to 2024, and when they first get there, they're reaffirm, hey, we got to be careful. We can't, we got to worry about butterflies. Anything we do could affect the future. So they then proceed to use the transporters to beam right into the middle of Los Angeles where anyone can fucking see them, which sure enough somebody does. and they beam Rios beams in the mid-air, because I guess they don't know how to operate a transporter properly, and breaks his arm and has to go to the hospital and gets arrested by ICE and all this other bullshit that he was never meant to be there. But I chose the episode Hide and Seek specifically because this is the episode where Jurati has been taken over by the Borg Queen, and she assimilates all these men and who are from this timeline, and turns them into Borgs and sends them out to hunt down, Picard and his friends. And Picard and his friends proceed to kill them all! Murder all these people who they have no idea they're from this timeline. They have no idea if any of these men will have children who could start a whole time. They could be erasing entire families. There could be, thousands of people who will never be born because they fucking killed these men. And maybe these men were important. Maybe these men went on to do something very important for the rest of their lives. Maybe they found the cure to something. But no, they can't, because they're dead. And they didn't even consider this as they were murdering all of them. And then, you had the whole thing with Rio staying behind in the 2024, which is worse than what Kirk did by taking Jillian into the future. He's actually staying in a timeline where everything he does was never meant to happen. So, all these alternate timelines and futures that he could have created just by simply being there. So, yes. That was my number 2 most reckless use of time travel. Now, if that was only number 2, then what could be number 1? Well, to be fair, that was a very, very close number 2. But my number 1 worst, most reckless use of time travel in Star Trek is, of course, the Voyager episode Endgame, because that's always my number 1 for anything worse. Ugh, I can't stand this episode. So, and this is something I've talked about a lot when I ranted and raved about this episode. Admiral Janeway comes from a future where they defeated the Borg, and her entire crew got home safely, save for like 16 people. But she lost twice that in 7 years, and yet in 16 years, only 16 or whatever it was. That's actually pretty good. But 2 of those 16 just happens to be good friends of her. So she's being completely selfish by saying, oh, well, 7 of 9 died, so I had to go back and risk the entire timeline just to save one person. And see, this is why this is way more reckless than what Harry Kim and Chakotay did in the episode Timeless, because they were saving the entire crew of Voyager, where Janeway, actually, the crew of Voyager actually had a happy ending. They got home. Kim became a captain. B'Elanna and Tom Paris had a kid who went into Starfleet. Even the Doctor gets a wife. Like, it's a pretty happy ending for most of them. It's, you know, Tuvok has this disease that he wouldn't have got. It could have been cured had they got back to Alpha Quadrant sooner. Sure. And 7 of 9 died. But everyone else had a pretty happy ending, and they defeated the Borg. But Janeway's going to put all of that at risk by traveling back and trying to get Voyager home sooner. And she chose like a timeline where they could have used the Borg, you know, intergalactic hub or whatever the fuck it was, to get home. And in doing so, she brings all this futuristic technology that is used to fight the Borg and just hands it to them so that the Borg can assimilate it and come up with defenses for it. That's smart. That's just great. You know, and judging by Picard, I think they'd have us believe that the Federation destroyed the Borg anyway, defeat the Borg anyway. But really, if you followed this episode to its logical conclusion, the Borg should have assimilated Earth and everyone, all of humanity, and ended Starfleet, because fucking Admiral Janeway just handed them what they needed to come up with defenses for this technology 200 years before they're supposed to have it. just so she can save 7 of 9's life. 7 of 9's life is more important. Like, and I talked about this in other videos. Like, why is she just worried about 7 of 9? What about all those like 50 or 40 other people that died in the 7 years before? Well, fuck them. I don't give a shit about them, because none of them are my close friend. It is so reckless. So reckless. Anyway, that is my number 1 most reckless use in all of Star Trek. So, those are my top 10 most reckless uses in Star Trek. I'm sure I might have forgot something. If you leave it in the comments below, I might be like, oh shit, I forgot about that one. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. Thanks so much for Brandon and Norman for suggesting this video, and all those who support me on Patreon, and all those who support my channel. Thank you so much. Be sure to check out my channel, as I do many more Star Trek videos, and covering other shows like House of the Dragon, Lord of the Rings of Power, and Star Trek Lower Decks, and much more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that, and thanks so much for watching.